I am.
I got it right? Okay, the downside of the lunch break is I thought of a couple things to follow up from this morning. So, let me get the word right. Speaking of the collegiate recovery communities at Texas Tech and Rutgers, do you know whether those facilities are free for those students?
So I don't know specifically. I know that Texas Tech has done a great job of identifying funding sources to support their students and offering scholarships. Again, the recommendation for collegiate recovery communities is specifically to abate the opioid crisis here in Oklahoma, and so that recommendation is specifically based on what is happening here in Oklahoma and not those other programs.
Right, and in fairness, those programs cover alcohol and other drugs, correct?
Correct.
In fact, they also cover students with eating disorders.
That is my understanding, or I think they also, one of the groups that they offer is for sexual addiction as well.
You mentioned a study this morning that I think you said 80% of people that have OUD start out with a prescription medication.
Correct.
What study is that?
I can't think of the reference off the top of my head.
Okay. Are the 80%, are they start with a valid prescription?
That's my understanding.
But you have no idea what the name of that study
I don't
is?
have that reference on hand.
Do you know who wrote it?
I don't.
Do you know who published it?
No. To all of these, the same response that I don't have that reference on hand.
Have you actually read that study?
Yes, I have.
Okay. When did you read it last?
I couldn't tell you.
Do you know if you've read it in connection with this case?
I've read it over the course of my responsibilities as executive director for the Center for Wellness and Recovery.
So sometime in the past year?
Correct.
Okay. How many licensed doctors are there in the state of Oklahoma?
I don't know the number of licensed physicians in the state of Oklahoma.
How many licensed doctors in the state of Oklahoma prescribe opioids?
I do not know the number of licensed physicians who prescribe opioids in the state of Oklahoma.
Do you know how many DEA licenses there are in the state of Oklahoma?
I do not know the number of DEA licenses in the state of Oklahoma.
Do you know how many doctors in the state of Oklahoma are fully aware of the risks and benefits of opioid medications?
I do not.
Do you know how many are unaware of the risks and benefits of opioid medications?
I do not.
Do you know how many of the doctors are unable to properly prescribe opioid medications for their patients?
I don't know. I know that there are requirements for proper prescribing that have been implemented to respond to the opioid crisis as it stands. So I assume that it's necessary to abate this crisis.
Yeah, thank you. My question was, are you aware of any doctors that are unaware or that are unable to properly prescribe opioid medications to their patients?
The physicians I work with are able to properly prescribe.
Does that mean you're unaware of any doctors that are unable to properly prescribe?
I do not know the number of physicians that are unable to properly prescribe. They do exist in the state.
Who are they?
I don't know.
Are you aware of any?
We can refer to previous testimony by Ms. Hughes, who referenced specifically a provider who gave her prescription opioids and she became addicted. We have case studies within this case. That's not why I'm here to testify. I'm here to testify on solutions to the crisis.
In fairness, Ms. Hughes testified she doesn't know what her doctor knew about prescription opioids. Do you recall that?
I do recall that.
Can you identify a single Oklahoma doctor who is unaware of the risk associated with opioid medications?
I'm not currently surveying Oklahoma doctors. I am currently providing education for these physicians.
And I'm not saying you have to answer my question yes or no, but I would like an answer to my question. Can you identify a single Oklahoma doctor who is unaware of the risk associated with opioid medications?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to ask an answer.
I'm sorry, I don't think she's answered the question. I told her she didn't have to answer. Thank you.
No, I cannot name a single provider.
How has the impact of all the media attention surrounding the opioid abuse in Oklahoma factored into what the state has presented in the abatement plan?
I'm not aware that media has played a role in the abatement plan.
Do you think that the media coverage has gotten the word out with respect to the opioid issues
No, not sufficiently.
at all?
Are you implying that by airing this testimony, it's going to change opioid prescribing or opioid use behaviors in the state of Oklahoma?
I wasn't talking about the trial. I was talking about in general about opioid issues.
Ma'am, I'm really unclear about what this question is and what conclusions you're trying to draw.
I'm just asking, you're aware that there's been coverage in the media for some time about opioid issues?
I don't watch TV, so I may be less aware of what is going on in the media.
I understand that. I don't watch much TV either, but there's print media that has opioid coverage, correct?
Okay, I will agree with you that the crisis has gained media attention. That in and of itself does not affect or stop the crisis from existing.
And my question was, do you think it has any effect?
I'm unclear. This is not something that I study.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move on to the other portions of your plan. We'll talk about the educating doctors portions. I
Great.
think there were 5 sections on that, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
In 1 through 5, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the first one is the continuing medical education.
Right.
In 1. So the topics you want to cover, as I understand it, in your continuing medical education portion are pain management, correct?
Correct.
Opioid management,
Correct.
non-pharmacologic therapies,
Correct.
addiction and mental health,
Yes.
overdose medical education,
Yes.
critical appraisal of medical evidence.
You missed one, which is pain prevention.
I apologize. Okay, pain prevention, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And then critical appraisal of medical evidence.
Correct.
Thank you. Sorry, my list was incomplete. Don't doctors learn how to critically appraise medical evidence in law school, medical school?
They may, and just like when I showed you with the curriculum map, it is important to continue that education over time and to update information. There are new techniques in conducting analysis. Providers may want to pay particular attention to meta-analyses or things in that realm, and there's also new studies coming out that physicians should be aware of.
Fair. Medical information changes over time.
Correct.
Okay. Who sets continuing medical education requirements in Oklahoma?
I think that the boards have a huge role in that. I'm not sure who else has influence on that. The state legislature has certainly addressed this to some extent with recent policies.
Does the ME board and the DO board set certain requirements for doctors in Oklahoma?
They do.
Okay. And again, you rely on your experience and training to determine these topics for continuing medical education, correct? You did not consult any medical boards to prepare your opinions on these topics, is that correct?
That is correct.
And your cost for the year 1 for CME courses is approximately $840,000, correct? $843,446?
Correct.
And am I understanding correctly, this is the one where you're dividing the state of Oklahoma into 4 quadrants?
Correct.
So we've got northeast, northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast,
Correct.
and you're doing 10 programs in each quadrant?
In year 1.
Right. I'm sorry, I'm just doing year 1.
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree with me there's less doctors in the southeast and northeast part of the quadrant? Northwest, southeast quadrants than, for example, in the northeast quadrant?
So These are also averages of assuming there's an average of 150 providers for training. So there may be 80 providers who are attending specific quadrants. The purpose is to make sure that the physical location of the events are accessible for all providers within the state of Oklahoma.
So there may be 150 that go in the northeast quadrant to a session, whereas in the northeast quadrant, which is less densely populated, less doctors will go to it.
Rather, the average would be 150. So there may be 100 in one quadrant and 250 in another, and 100 in the third quadrant, etc.
Okay. And part of your cost estimate in this includes paying doctors the $125 per hour to incentivize their attendance, correct?
Correct?
Are you familiar with Dr. Maslam-Dust?
No.
He's one of the plaintiff's experts in this case. He testified. You didn't see or read his testimony?
I did not.
Okay. He testified that the payment he's receiving in this case, $850 per hour, doesn't cover his overhead for missing time from his office. Are you aware of that?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. This is completely outside the scope of the direct examination. It's nothing to do with your testimony today.
She's trying to incentivize doctors to testify. Dr. Maslam-Dust said $850 doesn't cover his overhead. I don't think Dr. Maslam-Dust would be incentivized to attend for $125.
I sustain the objection.
If it's important to have doctors attend these depositions, why don't you make attendance mandatory?
I don't think you meant depositions.
I'm
in
sorry.
that question.
You're right. If it's important to attend, why don't you make the CMEs mandatory?
I don't quite understand. Are you asking me to speak for the board and to require something as though I have authority over the board?
Well,
This is a solution that I can propose as not being a member of a medical board.
sure, I understand that. You can't make them mandatory, right?
Correct.
Okay. You could recommend they be mandatory, right?
Perhaps.
Okay. I mean, you can't make anybody attend the CMEs, right?
Correct.
You're making recommendations.
Correct.
You could recommend they be made mandatory.
I could,
Okay. Why don't you recommend they be made mandatory?
because I don't want to hurt rural physicians practicing in Oklahoma by requiring them to take time off of work to drive some even short distance for continuing medical education in order to receive education.
Now, this is based on a grant. The program is based on a grant that that the Wellness Center received, correct?
No, this is continuing medical education is not based on a grant that we received. We have grants that include continuing medical education. Maybe you're thinking about the waiver training.
No, didn't you receive a $1.4 million grant from the CDC?
Yes.
For continuing medical education?
It is for education and for rural communities, including education for the general population, for law enforcement, for everyone in that community who is impacted by this opioid crisis.
That includes doctor.
It does include CME.
Okay, so
That is only one portion of that grant.
fair enough. Perhaps I asked an artfully worded question. Part of that grant is for CME.
Correct.
Okay, fair enough. Maybe we were miscommunicating. So that grant provided a number of CMEs, correct?
That grant will provide a number of CMEs. We are still in the planning process and will be executing next month and in August.
Has Dr. Beeman not provided any of those CMEs to date?
Those CMEs he's offered via other mechanisms, but not through this particular grant.
I understood Dr. Beeman to testify in this case that he's given some continuing medical education, I thought through that grant, but maybe there are other vehicles on opioid prescribing and the risk of addiction.
There are other vehicles by which the center and Dr. Beeman give continuing medical education on these topics.
That was not through the grant?
Correct.
Okay, I misunderstood. And those are archived and available for doctors online, correct?
Those that are conducted through our CME office at Oklahoma State University are archived and available online. They're not very engaging.
I'm not going to tell Dr. Beeman you said that. That's not very nice.
My recorded lectures are not very engaging to sit and watch. It's much better to have me in person.
But they are available for a nominal fee, correct?
Yes,
Could you repeat that?
Sure, they're available for a nominal fee.
I'm unclear of what the CME office charges
Okay.
for those.
I believe Dr. Beeman testified they're available for $25. Do you have any reason to doubt
No,
that?
I have no reason to doubt that number.
If that's accurate, then doctors could attend CME on these topics and not have to have the travel cost and the lodging cost set forth in your proposed CME budget. Is that fair?
Potentially.
And you would also not have to take the time that you referenced earlier from these rural doctors, correct? At least the travel time.
It should still take the same amount of time that we're reimbursing simply for the time of the continuing medical education. We're reimbursing them for $125 for 1 hour. For 1 hour of CME, we're not reimbursing them for their travel time, which would still be an expense for them.
Are doctors currently paid to attend CME offered by OSU?
They are not,
Are you,
because we need this in place to abate the crisis.
are you aware of any payment, is payment to attend CME standard in Oklahoma?
It is not, because in no other area of medical care do we have a crisis that we need to abate like the opioid crisis.
In no other area of medicine, there's a crisis.
To abate currently like the opioid crisis.
Okay. Do you agree that CME should cover fundamental concepts of pain management?
I agree.
Do you agree that CME should cover how to assess patients in pain, identify risk factors for misuse, abuse, and addiction?
Yes.
Do you agree that CME should cover range of therapeutic options for management of pain, including non-pharmacologic and pharmacological approaches?
Yes, I believe these are the same recommendations that we discussed on that.
Do you agree
Fine.
that CME should cover and teach doctors how to safely and effectively manage patients on opioid analgesics?
Yes.
Do you agree that CME should teach the fundamental elements of addiction medicine and how to identify and manage patients with OUD?
Yes.
Do you agree that CME should teach doctors how to counsel patients and caregivers about the use of naloxone for opioid overdose?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the opioid REMS program?
I have heard of it.
Do you know it's an FDA-mandated class-wide risk evaluation and mitigation strategy?
That is what my understanding of REMS stands for, and that it started in 2012.
Have you reviewed the content of it?
I have not.
Have you reviewed the number of Oklahoma physicians who have been part of the REMS program?
I have not.
Do you know how many times Janssen's sales representatives, back when Janssen was still promoting Nucenta, encouraged Oklahoma doctors to take advantage of the REMS educational opportunities?
I do not. Our recommendations are specifically that these be in place and free from proprietary and pharmaceutical industry influence.
Do you know what's covered by the REMS?
I do not.
Your Honor, I'd like to show the opioid REMS webpage. May I publish?
Ms. Baldwin, any objection from the state?
No objection.
Janice?
Permission to publish.
Thank you. Do you see the core messages included portion here?
I do.
Can you read the first bullet point, please?
The fundamental concepts of pain management, including definitions and mechanisms of pain.
And do you understand these are the issues covered by the REMS program?
I do. Can you tell me how many hours this REMS program is?
let's see. I don't know that I can by looking at this portion of the webpage. I don't know that I can by this portion of the webpage. Can we agree that it provides the items listed here on the core messages?
Without seeing the content, I can read to you what your bullet points are, but I have not reviewed the curriculum for what this REMS program is, and so if you're asking me to make expert testimony on whether or not REMS is adequate or is addressing these bullet points, I don't have enough information in front of me.
All I ask is can we agree that these messages are covered by the REMS program?
What messages specifically?
The fundamental concepts of pain management and definitions and mechanisms of pain.
I can't agree that it is covered without seeing the content of your curriculum.
Does it say these core messages include?
Your product has that comment, yes.
Well, that's not my product. This is the REMS compliant accredited CE for opioid analgesics, correct?
Correct, that is the title of this page.
Okay. And this document says the FDA has developed core messages to be communicated to providers, correct?
It does say that.
And it says these core messages include, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Wouldn't you want to know what education is currently in existence before you propose something?
No, because it's being provided by a proprietary agency, and my recommendation is that this be free of proprietary influence.
You wouldn't even want to know what's out there before you propose something else?
No.
Are you aware of the American Society for Addiction Medicine?
Yes.
Did you look at what CME, I'm sorry, I keep wanting to say CLE because that's what I'm more familiar with, that it has available?
I know that ASAM has continuing medical education available.
Did you look at what CME ASAM has?
I have not recently reviewed the CME for this case.
Have you ever looked at what CME ASAM has about opioid-related addiction issues?
Yes, and in fact, our providers have been through ASAM courses and are ASAM instructors.
And this is just the ASAM webpage. I just want to use it as a demonstrative, Your Honor.
Any objection? You may propose.
Are you familiar with the ASAM webpage?
I am?
And it includes the following classes. The first one, the ASAM Annual Conference. Do you see that on the left side of the page?
I do.
For Innovations in Addiction, Medicine, and Science. It's a live conference. Looks like provides education on the best practices and innovations in addiction medicine. Are you familiar with that program?
Yes.
Have you been to that program?
I have not.
And then there's the ASAM State-of-the-Art Course in Addiction Medicine. Do you see that program?
I do.
And it's an advanced course on knowledge and breakthroughs and treating addiction for physicians and clinicians. Have you been to that program?
I'm not a physician or a clinician, so no, I have not.
Well, I know you've taught some CMEs and been to others, I assume, so thought it was a fair question. But if you hadn't been to it, it's fine. You see the ASAM Review Course in Addiction Medicine?
Yes.
And it's an advanced course on knowledge and breakthroughs. Oh, sorry. A primer for physicians taking the exam and clinicians preparing for a career in addiction medicine.
Correct.
I'm going to ask if you've been to that one. I know you
I have not.
maybe not clinician preparing for a career in addiction medicine. I think that's also a live CME as well. Have you been, you see the next one's the ASAM treatment of opioid use disorder. I think that's a live and online program. It covers all medications and treatment for opioid use disorder and provides education required to get the waiver to prescribe buprenorphine, correct?
Correct?
Have you been to that program?
I have not.
Are you aware of it?
Yes?
I think the next one is is it CORE or CORE? ASAM pain management and opioids balancing risk and benefits. I may have jumped ahead. It's an online program. Sorry, Ms. Conway. I jumped ahead of her. You with me now? I may have jumped too far ahead.
Yes, she's referring to the last one.
It's the last one, star or. Reviews safe prescribing habits and examines the difference between opioid medications to help ensure patient safely and effective pain management.
Yes?
Are you familiar with that one?
I see it in front of me.
Okay. Have you heard of it before?
Not before now.
Okay. So I assume you've not attended?
Correct.
Okay. And then I think we're going to have to go back up for the ASAM Fundamentals of Addiction Medicine 40-hour CME course. Innovative educational program empowering primary care and other providers to diagnose and treat patients at risk for and with addiction. Are you familiar with that program?
Yes?
Have you been to that program?
No?
Looks like it's also an online CME. Is that correct?
That is what it looks like.
What attempts have you made to determine that these already in place CMEs are proper prescribing and addiction are attended?
Can you repeat that question?
What attempts have you made to determine that these already in place CMEs on proper prescribing and addiction are attended by Oklahoma doctors?
How have I promoted them, in other words?
No. Do you know if Oklahoma doctors attend these two programs we just talked about, either the REMS or the ASAM?
Since I am not in charge of those programs, I cannot speak to how frequently Oklahoma providers travel to live in-person ASAM CME or utilize the online CME.
Or the REMS program we talked about?
You may have more information on the use of the REMS program.
But you don't know as you sit here today, correct?
Correct.
You haven't measured the success of these already in place CMEs, have you?
I have not.
You don't have a way to determine which proposed topics are more effective than others at abating the crisis, do you?
No, I believe that's an empirical question that's important to answer so that we can put resources appropriately into the things that are successful.
And for the CME topics, have you determined which topics should be done when?
No, again, that's a question that speaks to implementation, and we are not yet to implementation. I do believe that some of the questions that you're asking now could be addressed in an implementation phase for this abatement plan and for CME in particular.
Should certain topics, is there a topic that should be done in perpetuity for the entire period of your abatement plan?
For the continuing medical education specifically.
Yes, ma'am.
These, if you recall, this is a phase-down recommendation, and so I would find it very difficult to say one of the 7 topics that needs to be done over the course of the 15 years until there, or excuse me, the first 11 years until there's only one CME available per quadrant.
So is there,
I do not have as I sit here today, I do not have a recommendation. I would say that we, as you've referred to earlier, and I have referred to earlier in my testimony, we will be doing some evaluative components for these programs and ensuring that what is successful is replicated.
But as you sit here today, you don't know which program will still be going on at that 15th year.
Not as we sit here today.
And your plan contemplates the CMEs being open to any healthcare provider regardless of specialty, correct?
Correct.
And it's not limited to doctors licensed by the DEA to prescribe Schedule II narcotics, correct?
Correct.
I think in your deposition that you recommend or suggest that veterinarians attend the CME, correct?
Correct.
Do you know if Janssen ever promoted their products to veterinarians?
Again, I would defer to other experts in this case and in this testimony who are speaking specifically about what Janssen or Johnson & Johnson has done. That's not my expertise in this matter.
So what are we abating with the CMEs?
The crisis of overprescribing and opioid use disorder in the state of Oklahoma.
And what is the metric for that?
So as I look at these topics, and again, you're asking me something very specific that would speak to implementation and implementation of an evaluative plan, which I do believe is another piece of the abatement plan, which is not why I'm here to testify. But it seems clear to me from these topics that because overdose is a topic, overdose would be an evaluative metric. It is a topic listed here. Because non-pharmacological, non-opioid therapies are here, the number of opioid prescriptions in the PDMP could be a metric for evaluation. I'm speaking off the cuff. We do not have a plan as I sit here today to evaluate this. I know that it is part of the implementation for this abatement plan.
Tell me how you would evaluate overdoses with respect to physician education. How do you correlate those?
We would correlate them. They may be correlative. I'm not saying that it's causational.
When will you know that physician education has taken hold and the crisis is abated, to use your terms?
Again, this speaks to an evaluation plan, which is not my part of testimony today. I'm here to speak about the need for continuing medical education as part of the solution.
How many doctors in Oklahoma currently need to be retrained?
I don't have those numbers in front of me. I believe that there's, even if a provider in Oklahoma is providing appropriate care at this moment, additional education is not going to hurt their practice. It will only benefit their patients.
Let's turn to your next part of the plan, which is addiction medicine. You recommend this at both medical schools, the College of Dentistry, the physician assistant schools. How many of those are there in the state?
2,
Where are they?
OU and OSU.
And then you also recommend those at all the nursing programs?
Correct.
I'm sorry, in the state? I said it this way. And Dr. Beeman has testified earlier this week that all OSU second-year students, consistent with how you testified earlier, I believe, regardless of what specialty they go to, are required to take an addiction-focused course? Correct? I'd like to use this just as a demonstrative, Your Honor.
No objection.
Permission to
Thank
publish.
you. Candace, can you put the bottom paragraph up for us? This is from your website, I believe, the OSU Center for Wellness and Recovery. Do you recognize that?
I do.
Okay. And you see that bottom paragraph?
Yes.
You familiar with this portion of the webpage?
I can't say that I've been on our own webpage recently, but I'm familiar with our webpage.
Fair enough. If someone asked me about my webpage, I'm not sure I could recognize it either. But you see that bottom paragraph?
Yes.
And it talks about the addiction program at OSU. If you read, starting at since 2014, you see where I'm reading?
Yes.
Okay. Since 2014, all second-year medical students at OSU are required to take an addiction-focused course consisting of 16 hours of instruction time. Is that correct?
That's what this says.
Okay. Are you aware of that requirement?
I was aware that it is a required course. This is less instruction time than the syllabus that I reviewed.
And what is the syllabus that you reviewed?
The syllabus that I reviewed, I believed, had 40 hours of time, but I'll defer to this website. And so if previously I said 40 hours, then that's 16 it is.
It's possible they've upped it and not in.
Or yes, it is possible.
And then I think you told us about this, required to complete clinical rotations at 12 and 12, correct?
Right, and it's actually an option to do rotation, so that is an error on the website.
It's not required?
It is not a requirement.
Dr. Beeman testified at trial that the rotation at 12 and 12 is required.
Okay, so this is my understanding. He is the clinical chair of psychiatry, and so his role is more directly in training these. And other places on this website, you will see that he is the director of training and education for the center.
And I'm not trying to catch you on that. I just wanted to let you know. I believe he testified that it was required. So, and OSU is not unique in that regard, is it? Requiring addiction training for all students?
That has been a trend nationally. There was at one point in time an article where, and a petition where over 100 medical schools signed on. Now, when we started this program, it was unique to medical schools in the nation.
Was that in 2014?
So it's in the 2014-2015 academic year. It was in March 30th of 2015.
Fair enough.
I'm sorry, ma'am.
I forget that step, Your Honor. I apologize. I've handed you what I've marked J1815. This is a print off of an article from, I believe, the Daily Oklahoman. Yeah. Well, yes, it's from the Daily Oklahoman. It's on the News OK website. I'd like to ask some questions about it, so I'll move its admission.
Is this article an article referencing Dr. Cross, with Dr. Cross specifically?
No.
I just see.
It
Okay,
is
so
not.
what is that required to?
I'll just ask her some questions about it if she doesn't have any. I can hold off moving its admission for a moment. Are you aware that the University of Oklahoma also trains its medical students on addiction?
No, I don't work for them, so I'm not sure what they're doing.
The article references that all medical students in Oklahoma, regardless of their specialty, are trained in addiction medicine. Are you familiar with that?
What line are you on, ma'am? I'm a slow
Can I read
reader.
it, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
It's tiny print, so it's on the first page. I'm going to lean over you. I don't want to get in your space here. It says all Oklahoma medical students, whether they will become radiologists, surgeons, or pediatricians, are trained in addiction medicine. Do you see where I read?
I do.
Do you have any reason to doubt that?
I do not. This is from 2017, so I don't know if that's changed or not.
You think they used to be trained on
I
addiction
don't,
medicine
I
and
don't
no
know.
longer are?
If you're questioning me about what OU is doing in the medical school, I'm just not aware.
Okay. You have no reason to dispute they're currently trained, do you?
I have no reason to
I'm
dispute
gonna guess
this.
this is hearsay, and, I mean, I don't know. It's just the author saying that this is the case. I don't know if this is true at all.
It's a news article.
She doesn't have any knowledge of this.
Okay.
Sustained.
Before offering opinions on the training of medical students, did you do anything to verify whether or not OU Medical Center trained physicians on addiction medicine?
I was asked to help develop a plan in training medical providers on how we would address the opioid epidemic. This is a recommendation based on my expertise and my experience on how we would abate the crisis. This is not about what the state is investing in independent of abating the crisis.
So if OU Medical Center is already doing it, we don't need to do it again, do we?
That sounds like it's coming at some cost to the taxpayers, and if it's not the taxpayers' responsibility, then we need to do it differently.
So the answer to my question is we don't need to do it twice, though, do we?
We may need to identify a different payment source.
But we don't need to do it twice, do we?
Your Honor, I'm gonna object to the answer.
Sustained.
Do you know whether the physician assistant programs offer addiction medicine training?
I do not.
Did you do anything to determine that?
No.
Did you do anything, do you know whether the nursing schools offer training?
They very well may, and my answer would be the same, that this is what is necessary to abate the crisis.
Did you do anything to determine whether the nursing schools have?
The nursing schools may or may not, but they need to do this in order to abate the crisis.
And they may already be doing it.
They may.
How about the College of Dentistry? Did you determine whether?
They may already be
I'm
doing
sorry.
it, but this is necessary to abate the crisis.
That you didn't contact anybody at the College of Dentistry to
No, ma'am.
determine whether they were teaching an addiction medicine course?
No, ma'am.
You know that Janssen's sales representatives never called on dentists, right?
I do not know that because I'm not here to testify on what Janssen or Johnson & Johnson's responsibility is.
And your plan contemplates educating categories of healthcare providers that Janssen never promoted to, correct?
I do not know who Janssen promoted to, so I cannot answer that question.
And this plan contemplates educating healthcare providers that will never obtain a DE license to prescribe Schedule II narcotics, correct?
This plan addresses how to abate the crisis by re-educating all individuals that would practice medical care, regardless of DEA licensure.
And again, with this part of the abatement plan, how do we know when it's abated?
Again, that goes to the evaluative portion and an implementation of this project.
And how will we know? Is this something you're not prepared to talk about?
This is not part of, I'm prepared to talk about solutions, not our evaluative measures of this program. That's another section of the plan.
Let's turn to your, you call it the case management, medical case management consultant. It's the Project Echo portion.
And
You
there's,
said that originated in, I believe, New Mexico.
yes,
Do you know if New Mexico pays its participants to participate in the Project Echo?
this is a unique aspect of our plan.
So no, they don't?
They do not.
Okay. And do I understand, I think New Mexico originated their Project Echo for a hepatitis C outbreak?
Correct.
And I have looked at your webpage and for the Wellness Center, and it covers many topics, correct?
For
Project Echo.
Project Echo specifically does cover multiple topics.
Okay.
It is an independent initiative for the Center for Health Sciences.
Okay. So there's many other types of conditions that can have a Project Echo program, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Are there any doctors in Oklahoma today who have inadequate case consultant resources for their practice?
I don't have the specific data. I can tell you that we have one Project Echo with 25 seats available for addiction medicine in the state of Oklahoma. So if there are more than 25 physicians in this state who need case management for opioid use disorder, then we have inadequate ability to reach them.
Can you name any doctors in Oklahoma that have inadequate case consultant resources for their practice?
No, ma'am, I cannot name physicians.
And so Dr. Beeman's addiction medicine Project Echo, that meets Monday from noon to 1:30?
That is my understanding.
And I understand, you don't sit through Project Echo, do you?
Correct.
Is it all for either physicians or healthcare providers?
That is my understanding.
I mean, assume a PA could participate?
Correct.
Okay. And it's been in place for some time, correct?
Project Echo came to OSU more recently, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the exact date. In the past 4 years, certainly, but I don't recall the exact date.
And it's a web-based program?
It is.
Someone, can't remember, was it your deposition or someone else referred to it as like WebMD, but for all doctors?
It wasn't my deposition. I
Okay.
referred to it as the Brady Bunch on a screen.
Okay. That's maybe a better way to refer to it, or the Beeman Bunch?
The Beeman Bunch.
Okay. And so the current participants are not paid for their time, correct?
Correct.
And you've made no attempt to measure its actual success, have you?
Correct. I'm not directly involved in Project Echo. There are scientific articles on Project Echo.
Did you read those in preparation for your testimony?
I have read them
Remotely in the past or recently?
remotely in the past.
Fair enough. Now, you recommend an expansion of that weekly for 25 clinicians to 20 weekly sessions, so it will reach 500 clinicians, correct? And is that limited to opioids, or it will be for any addiction?
So this is addiction medicine specific. I can tell you from the existing literature on Project Echo that in the addiction medicine echoes, opioids are the #1 discussed topic.
Would it be limited to that, or could a participant discuss a case that dealt with addiction to any substance?
If a primary care physician, this is what's necessary to abate the crisis, but if there are other benefits, so be it. So if a primary care physician needed recommendation on another substance, this would be the mechanism to get that case consultation.
And do I understand correctly that you recommend this program include not only family practitioners, but OBGYNs, nurse practitioners, and PAs? Physician's assistants. I shouldn't use their abbreviation.
That's correct. In the description, we have the cost required to reach 9,014 primary care physicians, OBGYNs, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants.
And so there's no requirement that the practitioners be licensed by the DEA to prescribe Schedule II narcotics, correct?
There is not a requirement to participate in Project ECHO. That may be a phase that is introduced in implementation of this recommendation in this plan.
And you're aware, aren't you, that Janssen never marketed opioids to OBGYNs?
Project ECHO is not about who's marketing. What it is about is being able to treat substance use disorders identified in patient populations, and nurse practitioners and physician assistants are able to get a waiver and treat patients with BUP.
So your plan contemplates Janssen and Johnson paying providers to attend Project ECHO, even though they're providers Janssen never spoke to and who never prescribed a Janssen product?
Again, I'm making recommendations on how to abate the crisis and to make sure that we have maximum reach in rural communities, which includes individuals who would be sought for primary care, which may be nurse practitioners. I myself prefer to see nurse practitioners or physician assistants. And so we want to make sure that they're able to treat opioid use disorder as their patients come to them and have a need for treatment.
Regardless of whether it has any connection to a Janssen product, correct?
The person treating opioid use disorder may not be the person, and likely is not the person who addicted the patient in the first place. So who marketed to whom is irrelevant for how to treat opioid use disorder.
And irrelevant to your plan.
Not irrelevant to my plan.
The use of the Janssen product is irrelevant to your plan.
It's not part of my expert testimony.
Mischaracterizes testimony of the witness.
Let's
I'm
restate
sorry.
the question, Ms.
Sure,
Fisher.
sure. I'm just trying to ask that your plan contemplates Janssen paying providers to attend the Project ECHO, even though they're providers that Janssen never spoke to and who never prescribed a Janssen product.
And I'm going to object to outside the scope. She has testified repeatedly that she's not here to testify on what Johnson & Johnson did or did not do, which providers they spoke to and which providers they didn't speak to.
That's the last question I have on that line, Your Honor.
Overruled.
I'm not here to speak about who Johnson & Johnson marketed product to. I'm here to speak to how we abate the opioid crisis in the state of Oklahoma.
I don't think that's, okay. So I don't think that's an answer to my question. I'm just going to try to ask one more time. Is it irrelevant to this part of your plan that these providers, I'll show that, does it not matter to your plan that these providers ever prescribed a Janssen product?
I'm going to object, ask Nancy.
Overruled.
It does not matter whether they prescribed a Janssen product in order for them to be able to treat opioid use disorder.
And be part of the project ECHO?
They can be part of a solution even if they were never part of the problem.
At what point will the results from Project ECHO constitute abatement?
Again, I don't have an answer to the evaluative plan for this piece at this time.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
No,
you. I
it's
thought you were finished. If you pause, I might jump in on you. I apologize. How will it be measured?
Again, I don't have an evaluation plan for this piece of the abatement plan at this time
Why did you choose 20 years?
because that's what is necessary to create adequate reach. If we look at 500 clinicians a year over 20 years, we will reach the 9,014 primary care physicians.
Is that why there's no reduction over the 20-year span as there are with other programs?
Correct.
I'm going to ask you now about the residency training. I think that's your M4 of the
Correct.
plan. And this program recommends 8-hour waiver training course for all second-year medical students, correct?
Medical residents.
I'm sorry, medical residents. And that's also known, I believe, as Data Abuse and Treatment Act, or is it DATA 2000?
DATA.
DATA, I'm sorry,
Yes.
DATA. And am I correct, this is one you have a current SAMHSA grant for?
Correct.
Okay. And are you in your last year or first year?
First year.
First year, okay. And that's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration grant, correct? And this grant funds the training of all OSU residents and practicing physicians on medicated assisted treatment and the treatment of opioid use disorder,
Correct.
and that medication assisted treatment, or MAT waiver, that is something that a physician gets from the DEA, correct?
Correct.
And that's the same DEA that doctors have to register with to prescribe opioids, correct?
Correct.
And bupe, as you call it, which I appreciate because that's one of those words that I tend to struggle over, is an opioid, correct?
Correct.
And do you know who makes bupe?
My understanding is that there are many manufacturers of bupe and that it is also an off-label.
So there's companies that manufacture buprenorphine, right?
Correct.
And I think you testified that you're not aware of a similar residency training program at any other university. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Are you aware that ASAM offers a DATA 2000 training program?
We went over it with the online training earlier.
Yes, that's right. I'm sorry, thank you. Are you aware that St. Francis Hospital in Tulsa also provides similar training?
I was not aware.
Are you aware that other Oklahoma hospitals do the same?
I was not previously aware, but I'm not surprised. I think it's appropriate.
You haven't measured the effectiveness of the SAMHSA program thus far, have you?
No.
You have not determined whether the current program has had any effect on abating the opioid crisis, have you?
Not yet.
How do you know the current program is effective and should be expanded with the funding you requested in the abatement plan?
Should have data in a couple of years. I'll be happy to share it. What we do know is that by training residents and them receiving their waivers, that they're able to treat opioid use disorder 30 patients in the first year and are able to apply to treat up to 100 in their second year of being waivered.
Do you also train physicians?
I conduct CME, so training physicians in that way, yes.
How do you plan to measure the results or success of the recommended training?
I plan to follow up with our residents and identify how many of them are using the waiver and to what extent it's impacted their practice.
Is that training all done at OSU Center for Health Sciences?
The trainings are at various locations around the state. So our first waiver training event was actually in Duncan at Duncan Regional Hospital.
Could that be done online?
It could, but we really do believe that in-person trainings are more effective and they're better, and there's a great opportunity in an in-person interaction for students to raise their hand. While this is not medical students, I've taught classes in person, online, and hybrid, and students always prefer either hybrid or in-person classes because they can interact and ask questions.
As more and more of these doctors are exposed to the educational resources, whether in medical school residency or post-residency practice of medicine, you don't account for the impact that any change in their prescribing or patient monitoring practices might have on the need for addiction treatment in Oklahoma, do you?
So I think part of my answer is that addiction treatment, so as we know it today, sitting here today, it could last a lifetime on bupe, and we need to make sure that there are a sufficient number of providers that can provide that in the future and moving forward. So this isn't we treat people and there's a static number over time. The more cases of opioid use disorder we identify, the more people we have to continue to treat over their lifetime.
And you haven't taken into account the impact on the future need of medical education, have you?
Can you rephrase that question? I'm not sure I know what you mean specifically.
As more of these doctors are exposed to educational resources, whether in medical school or residency, you don't account for the impact that any change in their prescribing or patient monitoring practices might have on the need for future medical education.
I'm sorry, are you asking specifically about the residency section now, or are you
Right.
talking about CME specifically, or are you talking about how these overlap?
I'm talking about the overlap, right? So if you've trained them now in the medical school or in the
Right.
residency, you haven't taken into account how that might affect the
So
CME.
that's where that curriculum map falls into place, because that's an introduction, and CME ends up being a reinforcer over time for practicing providers, just to remind them, reorient, give them a true north. A true north.
But if they've learned it in their residency or medical school and then in their residency, you don't need all this CME that you need for the ones that have been out for a while, correct?
We do phase down the CME in this plan, to be clear.
That's because you have to re-educate the doctors that are out there though, right?
Correct.
But you've got the ones in medical school that you're teaching it correctly to,
Correct.
under 2 and 3, correct? Or 3 and 4, I'm sorry. Correct?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers in front of me.
Yeah, I may have said the wrong numbers, but the residency and medical school training that we talked about.
I'm not sure what your question is. I'm sorry, I'm just going to ask you to rephrase it.
Sure, the CME that we talked about at the beginning.
Yes.
Did you take into account that you're also training medical students and residency?
Correct. So the medical students take 7 years from the point that we train them to when they're practicing, and our residents take still some time until they're practicing. It's not as long a window of time, right? That's a shorter time period if they're second-year residents. Our longest residency is 4 years for emergency medicine, to my knowledge. So it may be 2-3 years till they're out independently practicing. The continuing medical education is for the 9,000 existing primary care physicians.
So that continuing medical education doesn't take into account anybody who's in medical school or residency now? Because they're going to get out at some point and then in the next 20 years.
And from a curriculum mapping perspective, the more times we hear something, the more times we're reminded, the better we stick to that.
Let's go to the last section of for you, of the abatement plan, the academic medicine portion. And this is your endowed chair section.
Okay.
For both OU and OSU, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Now, after you endow this chair, this clinician, or these clinicians, they're going to see patients, correct?
The endowed chairs are researchers, and the providers are a separate personnel section.
Okay. The endowed chair wouldn't see patients?
They may, and so this again goes to implementation. If we hired a DO PhD or an MD PhD, they may do both research and see patients. Conceptually, most likely we will hire a PhD in the endowed chairs, and that the providers below would be the MDs and the DOs.
The providers below would see patients, correct?
Correct.
And they would presumably provide services then, correct?
Correct.
And would those services be done for free?
So again, that speaks to implementation of this. I think with their salaries covered, there are still other aspects of the clinical operation that would need to exist. So this plan does not include the need for counseling, which is a requirement. If you look at the ASAM requirements, it's a requirement when we have providers who prescribe PUP, they need to make sure that there is a counselor that they can refer to for those services. There's also overhead and other costs associated with running a clinic. That said, by covering the cost of the providers, you create a low-cost, easily accessible environment for every patient, regardless of payer source.
So if a patient had insurance, would the clinic accept that insurance?
That speaks to implementation.
So you don't know.
Correct.
If the state adopts the Medicaid Expansion Act, would this clinic accept that money?
This is what would be required to stand up an addiction medicine clinic for training and for research opportunities. In implementation, those are things that can be discussed in implementation.
So you don't know.
I don't know.
I'm correct, the primary source, in fact, the only source for this information is Dr. Beeman, correct?
The Department of Psychiatry is listed as the source, yes.
And you told us the source for that information was Dr. Beeman, correct?
Who's recently started the addiction medicine clinic under the Department of Psychiatry.
And you and Dr. Beeman spoke about what would be involved with this, correct?
Correct.
And it's your expectation as well as Dr. Beeman's that OSU, I'm sorry, well, that could get me in real trouble. OSU's Health and Wellness Center would become a world-class facility for the treatment of addiction, correct?
Correct.
And it was your expectation that any funding OSU would receive would go into the already existing Health and Wellness Center, correct?
What do you mean by Health and Wellness Center?
You're not setting up a new facility. It's going to go into the already existing facility.
Correct.
And you're aware of Purdue's $270 million settlement in this case, correct?
I am.
And that almost $200 million of that went in to fund the National Center for Addiction Studies and Treatment at OSU, correct?
Correct.
And that's the very type of addiction medicine department that's proposed in this part of the abatement plan, correct?
I'm not clear on the details of exactly what that settlement was for. So beyond what I can agree what you're saying here, that it's to fund a National Center for Addiction Studies and Services, and that it does sound like an academic medicine department because that's part of the abatement plan.
And we know it's going to OSU, correct?
Correct.
If the National Center for Addiction Studies and Treatment is already being funded in Tulsa, why would we need a second one in Norman or in Oklahoma City for OU?
Because education and research are collaborative, and we need to make sure for two reasons. One is that each of us is independently coming to new solutions. We shouldn't have solutions in silos that can help to interact with other academic medical centers. And for another, for breadth of reach. So there's a similar academic medicine department for Ryan White, and OU has a Ryan White clinic, as does OSU, and we divide the state for serving the state with those dollars.
And the name of the clinic is the National Center for Addiction Studies and Treatment, correct?
That's from the Purdue settlement. That's from the Purdue settlement. I'm not exactly sure is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yes.
It is for addiction in general, correct?
That's my understanding.
One minute, please.
Sure.
I have no further questions, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bishop. Ms. Baldwin, would you like to
I will.
redirect?
Dr. Koff, I have a few follow-up questions for you. You had some questions from Ms. Fisher about whether you're a medical doctor. Do you recall those questions?
I do.
You're not a medical doctor, right?
Correct. I'm a doctor of sciences. My favorite children's book about Louis Pasteur says Louis Pasteur was not a medical doctor, but a doctor of science. So be like Louis Pasteur.
And you teach doctors through continuing medical education, right?
I do.
And you work in a medical school?
Yes.
And how frequently do you interact with medical doctors?
I would say most days of the week.
You were asked some questions about LADCs. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Why are regular counselors on college campuses not equipped to deal with students with substance use disorders like OUD?
Individuals with substance use disorders require different and additional treatment. The LADC process helps to specifically train counselors in the skills necessary. These are courses that LADCs take in over and above the required courses that are necessary for them to be licensed professional counselors.
Do regular counselors run into problems when they attempt to treat students with substance use disorders like OUD?
Yes, so they often, because they don't have the specific training, they may overextend, and they have difficulty because they don't have the specific training or skills.
But for the Oklahoma opioid crisis, would we need LADCs on college campuses at the rates that you proposed in the abatement plan?
No.
You were also asked about measurable outcomes for the plan. You received several questions about that, is that correct?
That is correct.
Is there a section of the abatement plan that makes recommendations for monitoring, implementation, and evaluation?
It's my understanding that Jessica Hawkins and Terry White worked on those sections of the plan.
But are the recommendations, the individual recommendations that you made for the plan, are they evidence-based or evidence-informed? So in other words, they have documented successful outcomes?
Yeah, I would use the term evidence-informed because we've never faced anything like this before, so we have to borrow from other examples. So my history of work in alcohol use is an example of a knowledge basis that we've pulled from to adapt prevention and approach strategies.
So you have extensive experience in research, working in health promotion related to substance use disorders and alcohol.
And alcohol use, yes.
Okay, and do you feel that you can apply those skills that you've developed over the many years that you've been working in these fields and apply them to opioids?
I do.
And have you been doing that as part of your work for the center?
I have.
In fact, the center hired you to be the executive director to do what is necessary to abate the opioid crisis in Oklahoma. Is that true?
That's correct.
You were asked some questions about medical education and continuing medical education and what's needed. Do you recall that?
Yes.
So do you think that if all practitioners in Oklahoma were properly trained on this first circle here, pain, that we would have an opioid crisis right now?
If they were properly, historically, is that the question?
Yeah, if doctors were aware of non-pharmacological options or the risks associated with opioids and weren't prescribing them at increasing rates over time, as we've seen in this case from 1996 to the present, do you think that we would have an opioid crisis in Oklahoma?
Objection, Your Honor. She already testified she doesn't know about all the doctors in Oklahoma and what they do and when they do it.
Your Honor, she was asked questions about specific individual doctors, and I'm asking a more general question. She testified she hasn't talked to specific doctors, but I think she's certainly qualified to speak to the need of the profession in general and the quality of medical education within the profession.
She lacks the foundation and qualifications to speak of the training of doctors going back to 1996. I believe that was the word was just used wrong. I'm sorry, she lacks the foundation and qualifications to go back to 1996, which was the question that was just asked, I believe.
I don't think there's anyone more qualified. She's the executive director of the Center for Wellness and Recovery, an expert in public health, actually presents over the state of Oklahoma on the issue of the opioid crisis in Oklahoma.
The question had to do with the treatment of pain, not addiction.
And I'm referring to her, and is this a slide that you used to present regularly?
It is.
Okay, so one of my questions are directed at this slide that she presents in her talks around the state.
I overrule the objection to the question. Repeat the question.
So do you think, or let me ask you a more general question. Do you think that if practitioners in the state of Oklahoma were adequately educated on each of the circles in the presentation that you're currently providing to physicians that we would have an opioid crisis?
By addressing each of these circles, we can abate the opioid crisis.
So you think that there is a need to speak to practitioners throughout the state of Oklahoma on how to intervene at each of these points along this path in order to abate the crisis? Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. That's correct.
And is that what you teach?
Yes.
Are you aware that the REMS programs are funded by pharmaceutical companies?
I am aware.
Do you believe that Oklahoma doctors should receive continuing medical education through programs funded by the pharmaceutical industry?
I do not.
And the programs that you have recommended in the state's abatement plan, are those programs that are free of proprietary and pharmaceutical influence?
Yes.
And you were asked a lot of questions about REMS and other CMEs that, do you have an understanding that those are voluntary
Yes.
and that they do not provide incentives to physicians?
Correct.
Do you think that it's important to provide incentives to physicians, especially ones in rural communities, to attend these because they would benefit those physicians?
Yes.
And can you explain why incentives are so beneficial?
So if having things online stored somewhere was sufficient, we would already see the crisis abating. We need to incentivize and ensure that providers are attending these continuing medical education courses and measure those outcomes from the CMEs.
Do you think a doctor would be more likely to attend a CME activity if it was if they were incentivized or were going to be compensated for the time they'd be missing in their clinic, rather than if they just went online and had to miss an hour of work without compensation?
Yes.
So, in other words, do you agree that doctors would be more likely to get this medical education if they were incentivized to do so?
I do. That's why I included it in the plan.
Are you aware that veterinarians are able to prescribe opioid medications?
I've actually had the pleasure of training some veterinarians who have gotten dual DVM and PHs. It's an area where they're expanding, and they are quite vocal that they prescribe all of the medication, the same medications that our medical providers prescribe. And they've expressed to me cases of people coming with injured animals and seeking drugs for themselves once they're in the midst of opioid use disorder in order to receive additional opioids.
And so, is that one of the reasons that you included those as people who would receive continuing medical education?
Yes.
You believe they would benefit from that?
I do.
You were asked some questions about Project Echo and whether or not you are aware of any success of Project Echo. Do you recall that?
I do.
Have there been studies or evidence showing that Project Echo as an initiative, not necessarily here in Oklahoma, but I believe you talked about it starting in New Mexico, that those efforts have been successful?
Yeah, so they've been successful in reducing patient wait times and treating patients where they are.
Do you believe that when doctors and go through medical school and residency training that they no longer need medical education?
No.
So you don't believe that doctors learn everything they ever need to know about scientific evidence through medical school and residency training?
No, and they may get a very good basis, and to be quite honest, we forget what's in our training, and this is why we need reminders and continuing education. It's why it's required in most fields, just to refresh and reorient.
And so the research that you talked about earlier today, CBT, neonatal abstinence syndrome, non-pharmacological options, those are going to continue to develop, hopefully over time, as the state or the center or OU is able to obtain funding to carry out that research. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. I think we've done the best we can to create a plan for abatement, and those are based on what we know today, and that may change a whole lot over time.
So do you think that down the line, when medical students who are starting out in medical school today, and once they graduate and get through their residency, that there may be new evidence regarding NAS or CBT that they should be educated on through programs like the kind that you present at the Center for Wellness and Recovery?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of outstanding research being conducted today, and that will shape and change the continuation of education for providers.
And the CME programs that you're recommending and the CME programs that you provide at the center, are they tailored to the specific needs of Oklahoma communities and abating the specific problems with opioids that we have in this state?
So these are general topics, but the topics themselves and the presentations would be tailored to those communities. So the 4 week-long community events that we referred to earlier, those are specifically tailored with data for those communities so that those providers hear what is happening in their community and not even what's happening for the state in general, but more specific to their community.
Have you seen an abatement plan from the defendants in this case?
I have not. Is one available for me to review?
So you don't know if they've created one?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, I have no further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Fisher, I'll give you a chance to cross.
Does your facility currently prescribe opioids for the treatment of pain?
Which facility?
OSU, keep doing that. Center for Health Sciences?
So I'm not in charge of the Center for Health Sciences or we have a clinic within the umbrella of the Center for Wellness and Recovery, and that is an addiction medicine clinic.
Sure. Let me rephrase that then. Does OSU Center for Health Sciences prescribe opioids for the treatment of pain?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Really? You don't know at all if they prescribe opioids?
I know that our number 1 referral out of our system is for pain because our providers do not like to prescribe opioids. I don't know at what rate they prescribe opioids.
But you know they do.
I don't know that.
Okay. We are seeing an opioid overdose death decline in Oklahoma, right?
That's my understanding.
And so is the prevalence of OUD, correct? It's declining.
So the decline in overdose has been largely attributed to the Department of Mental Health's supply of naloxone and policy changes surrounding naloxone availability in the state. There's been a recent JAMA article on this that cited the benefits of what Oklahoma has done in that arena. Regarding the number of opioid use disorder cases that have been diagnosed, I can't speak to that, but I can tell you that diagnosis and what's existing in communities are different things, and that we need to screen in order to have a correct number for the number of people with OUD in the state.
You're not aware of the decline in the prevalence of OUD in Oklahoma?
I am not aware of that.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You may be excused. I do want to ask that over the break, I can get a report on the motions to quash trial subpoenas. If you want to think about that over the break, and then we'll get back.
Yes.
Talk to me about that.
I'd be happy to do that, Your Honor.
Okay, all right. Let's go ahead and take an afternoon break now and start again at 3:10. All right? you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you.
Your Honor, Ms. Hawkins, there's some materials that she'd like to have with her. We're not going to offer them into evidence, but just to, she has a big lift today of walking through the state's 62-page abatement plan, and so if it's all right with you, I have copies for you and for the court.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Ms. Hawkins. Can you introduce yourself to the court?
Yes, Jessica Hawkins.
And what do you do for a living?
I'm the Senior Director of Prevention Services at the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services.
And can you explain to the court what prevention services is?
Yes. So at the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, we have two main functions. One is to provide treatment services for substance use disorder and mental illness in the state of Oklahoma. And we also are responsible for providing prevention services. That is the prevention of substance use, prevention of suicide, mental health promotion. And in that role, I oversee the state's portfolio of substance use prevention dollars, and also additional discretionary grants, state appropriations, and other funding sources for prevention services.
How long have you been working in prevention services throughout your career?
About 20 years.
And where do you currently live?
In Edmond, Oklahoma?
Did you grow up in Oklahoma?
Yes. I was born in Stillwater, and moved shortly after I was born to Bartlesville, Oklahoma.
And after high school, where did you go to college?
I went to California State University in San Diego.
And did you obtain a degree there?
Yes.
And what was that?
A bachelor's in sociology.
Have you obtained any other degrees?
Yes, I have a master's in administrative leadership from the University of Oklahoma.
And when did you obtain that degree?
In 2016, I believe.
While you were working at the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health Services?
Yes.
Okay. Did you get your degree while you were working full-time?
Yes.
Do you have any other specialized training that you received during your career?
Yes, so I'm trained as a substance abuse specialist, which there are specific training programs in the prevention field for substance use prevention. In addition to that, I'm trained and certified as an instructor in several evidence-based prevention programs like mental health first aid and other suicide prevention interventions.
Let's go back to your college years for a few minutes. Did you gain any experience in training in prevention services while you were in college?
Yes, absolutely. So within my field of sociology, which I was first in a track for clinical care and decided ultimately to move into sociology to look at the social conditions that drive things like substance use and mental health problems, other public health concerns. In addition to that, I was working full-time in the prevention field while I was in college, and so I had the opportunity to train in prevention in Southern California, working in a pretty progressive environment around the prevention of alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use.
And did you work at a company called Mental Health Systems?
Yes, I did.
And what is Mental Health Systems?
Mental Health Systems is a large nonprofit in Southern California providing mostly substance use disorder and mental illness treatment.
And what did you do specifically at Mental Health Systems?
I worked on a county contract with the County of San Diego Health and Human Services, where we were contracted as an agency at Mental Health Systems to organize and provide alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use prevention in the North and Inland region of San Diego County.
Did you work with all age groups when you were at Mental Health Systems?
Yes.
So can you describe a little bit of your work with youth?
Sure. My first position was actually organizing youth coalitions and working with young people in advancing policies around tobacco control, alcohol prevention, and also drug use prevention. After that, I worked also at the American Cancer Society as a youth program manager doing tobacco prevention, tobacco control with youth programs.
So after you worked at after you graduated college, you continued to work at Mental Health Systems?
Yes.
How long did you work there?
I worked there for about 8 years.
And did you go to the American Cancer Society after you left Mental Health Systems?
Yes.
And what were your responsibilities at the American Cancer Society?
I had 2 roles there, as I mentioned already, as a program manager over the youth tobacco control programs, working mostly with universities, college campuses, and public school systems, and also with whole population community health programs that the Cancer Society had there. In addition to that, I held a role called the Mission Integration Manager, where the responsibility was to infuse the American Cancer Society's mission around cancer prevention predominantly into their development activities.
And were you promoted during your time at the American Cancer Society?
Yes.
So that was a promotion to Mission Integration Manager?
Yes, I moved from being within what they call the Border Sierra region in San Diego County to the California division of the American Cancer Society.
What brought you back to Oklahoma?
Hold on.
Sorry, of the American Cancer Society.
Sorry. What brought you back to Oklahoma?
My family. So I was born and raised here. I suppose I always intended to come back to Oklahoma to practice in my career and also to raise a family. I'm strong Oklahoma ties, and so we decided to come back here and raise a family.
Do you have kids?
I do. I
How
have
many
2.
do you have? 2?
I have 2 children.
What was your first role? So when you came back to Oklahoma, where was your first position?
At the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, I was a prevention program manager, and I was hired to oversee the state's youth suicide prevention initiative.
And so what other initiatives did you work on during your time as a program manager?
Shortly after coming to Oklahoma at the Department of Mental Health, I was also assigned to oversee our methamphetamine prevention initiative in the state. So I was doing that concurrently for a couple of years. In addition to that, I was consulting on the substance abuse prevention and treatment block grant particularly in the area of underage drinking prevention and also some adult binge drinking and impaired driving.
Were you promoted at the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services?
Yes,
So what was your first promotion?
to the Director of Prevention Services.
And then you were later promoted to Senior Director?
Yes.
And when was that?
Believe that was about 10 years ago.
Can you describe your responsibilities as Director of Prevention Services?
Yes, so it was a newly formed division. Our agency leadership really elevated prevention services within the role and mission of the organization. We very quickly developed a very competitive portfolio, applying for grants and such for prevention services here in Oklahoma, and we're able to grow that division. I think when I started, we had maybe half a dozen employees who were working underneath substance use treatment services predominantly, and since being in my role as a director, we've grown that division to about 20 to 25 full-time employees depending on the grant services, and we've been able to bring a significant amount of funds to the state. It's not enough for prevention services in our state, but have really been able to elevate the importance of prevention in the substance use field and also in the mental health field.
So was there a specific grant that helped transform the Prevention Services Department after you started working, or after you became director?
Sure. So in 2008, we applied for what's called a SIG grant, SIG, with SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And that particular grant was designed by SAMHSA to help transform state prevention systems, to really build an infrastructure within the state that could support evidence-based prevention services, that could also build the role of data collection, and also using epidemiology to inform decision making. So I applied for and we received the state's first SIG. It's called the Strategic Prevention Framework State Incentive Grant in 2008. That began in 2009.
And did you have to identify certain priorities when you were applying for that grant?
Yes, the first task and responsibility required by SAMHSA for that grant was to conduct a statewide needs assessment around prevention needs in the state. And it took about a year, but we hired epidemiologists. We formed what's called a state epidemiology outcomes work group to work across other state agencies with data analysts and others who collect measures and who monitor trends around substance use. We analyzed that information, all available indicators that we had access to around substance use at that time, and we prioritized two main issues in the state that were most pressing at that time. One was underage drinking and the other was prescription drug use.
So is it fair to say that your efforts and the efforts working with Commissioner Terry White really transformed, during this grant process, really transformed the prevention services program at your agency?
Yes, absolutely.
So as you grew the prevention department at your agency, what were your responsibilities as Director of Prevention Services?
Still as the director at
Or
that
what,
point.
you know, as the agency grew, or this department of your agency grew, what were your roles as director that you were engaged in on a regular basis?
So I'm responsible really for setting the strategic direction of the Prevention Services Division within the agency. I'm responsible for preparing funding proposals, for overseeing and developing substance use and other prevention programs throughout the state. I obviously supervise staff and hire and make sure that we have the staff capacity in place in order to manage and monitor these programs throughout the state. We take a very active role at the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. When we contract for services, we are often out in the field providing guidance and technical assistance. Most of the people I have on my staff, for example, are are trained in public health and have field experience and provide direct assistance out in the communities and in schools and other places where we have these services going. So in that role, it really is about setting the strategic direction for prevention services in the state, identifying needs, monitoring trends, also looking at the performance of our programs, working with contract or in-house evaluators to monitor effectiveness of what we're doing, and also really overseeing compliance too, to make sure that the services that we're purchasing are being done with fidelity, that they're also being done with high quality, and also that we're achieving the outcomes that we set out to achieve.
Is part of your role as director researching evidence-based programs?
Absolutely.
And is part of your role also presenting and representing the state at regional, national, and state conferences
Yes,
and organizations?
Yes, I frequently make presentations or provide testimony to legislators at interim sessions, also at national conferences, and with other associations and out in the community, speaking with people not only about our system and our work, but also hopefully trying to promote the use of prevention within our field.
So you mentioned funding, obtaining funding as one of your responsibilities. So you have experience obtaining funding for prevention services, is that right?
Yes.
Can you just explain how resource intensive this process is to the court?
Yes, I think you're talking about grant writing or
Yes.
preparing proposals. It's very resource intensive. One grant, for example, can be let out by a funder, and you might have anywhere between 2 or 6 weeks to make application. In that time period, there's a tremendous amount of effort to put together a listing or a selection of best practices, some sort of framework around what needs to happen within those plans. The hours really can range in terms of which funding proposal it is, how much the dollar amount is for, how complex the application is, what the issue matter is. But I don't think it would be too much to estimate that an average grant proposal application will take well over 40 hours, probably more.
And have you been putting together funding proposals for your entire career?
Yes, I didn't very much early on, 20 years ago, but pretty shortly after, yes. Every position I've had, I've been responsible for contributing to proposal writing, also developing funding proposals, and putting together plans, strategic plans. I would say in the prevention field, a lot of what we do is strategic planning. We're out there working with community groups and also with other stakeholder groups and sectors of the community, like healthcare sectors and others, putting together operations plans and also visions and recommendations around practices that will work.
As part of the grant process that you've been involved in, do you have experience implementing the programs and evaluating the programs for success?
Yes. I am not a program evaluator per se, but I work with them regularly. We contract for those services, or we have in-house expertise that work with programmatic staff in order to develop measures and to come up with methods to collect that information and also analyze it and report on it. Implementation is most of what I do. So after developing a strategic plan and overseeing actually the implementation of those plans, it's a regular part of my job.
And let's talk about the research that's part of your job that you've done as a prevention specialist. Can you just describe that research and what that entails?
The everyday research, or are you talking about?
Well, you testified that as part of your job, you research evidence-based
Yes.
practices. So can you just elaborate on that role that you have?
Yes, absolutely. So there's the more mundane following academic journal articles and monitoring daily, weekly with regularity any new research that's coming out, new findings, editorials about that research, but more specifically, we attend training. I'm often going to national conferences. In fact, one organization that I'm the vice president of, the National Prevention Network, hosts an annual prevention research conference, and so we're building that entire agenda for the year, putting together both researchers and practitioners together in the same space in order to talk about what works in prevention. In terms of my collegial relationships, I'm regularly involved in collaborating with folks like Dr. Croft and others who are either conducting research in the state of Oklahoma or nationally, connecting with them and working on collaborative projects.
Does your department do anything to make sure, other than the things that you mentioned, but does your department have a group to stay up to date on evidence-based research?
Yes, as part of the grant I talked about earlier, our state developed what's called an evidence-based practices work group. This is an interdisciplinary team of folks from other state agencies, researchers from university. They are prevention practitioners who come together on a regular basis and help review the evidence, look at best practice. They help advise us as a state agency from time to time about what types of interventions that they recommend that we implement and why. In many cases, we are working together to review work plans. So when we do contract for a prevention service, and we have a provider or somebody in the community who is providing back to us a plan about what they'd like to do, this evidence-based practices work group will review that plan and take into consideration whether these practices are likely to work. Do they meet the definitions of a best practice? And so in that way, we have this very dynamic relationship with this evidence-based practices work group, and it helps not only us as professionals, but also within the agency to make good decisions about what we'll fund and what we need in order to really make a difference.
And has your research related to preventing addiction and substance misuse or abuse or use?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Has the research that you've done related to preventing substance abuse, substance misuse, things of that nature?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question. Has the research...
Has your research related to substances, drugs,
Yes.
alcohol,
yes,
tobacco?
I'm sorry. Absolutely. I mean,
I'm sorry,
that's the
my
field
question
that I'm
wasn't
in,
clear.
so I
Yeah.
was confused. Yes, in fact, that's the research that I review is with regard to the prevention of substance use, alcohol, tobacco, other drugs. Also, of course, looking at co-occurring disorders, comorbidities, and different public health crises. And understanding trends, all of those things are involved, yes.
So is your training focused on preventing substance abuse in an individual or on a broader population level?
It's both. I would say predominantly we work in population health approaches where we are trying to make an impact on whole communities, whole sectors at a time, whole populations, because there are interventions that you can implement that produce a change in a large group of people at one time. They're often cost effective, they're often easier to implement at times, but we also provide services to the individual. They're not clinical in nature as you would see in a treatment setting, but for example, we fund school-based prevention programs that are delivered one-on-one. We have family-based interventions, working with family members on parenting skills and developing, nurturing parenting relationships with their children. And so the services that I oversee are both population health and sort of population-wide interventions, and also individual, family, and school-based interventions. It's in all of those domains.
So you've talked about designing and planning programs as part of your role. Can you talk a little bit about the strategic planning and how that's played a role in your career over the past 20 years?
Absolutely. So in my role as an administrator, it is my responsibility to make sure that if I am provided a source of funding or if we have to pursue a source of funding to address a certain public health problem, that we have a plan in place. And so there are different frameworks that are used to develop these types of plans. I don't know if she spoke to it, but Dr. Croft in her role with public health would be very familiar with the public health model. It's a framework that we use and a process to actually develop a plan where we're first identifying the problem and understanding the nature and the scope of that problem. We're also looking at risk. What's driving that problem? What are the risk factors in the community, in a family, in a young person that may be contributing? And then identifying evidence-based interventions, implementing them, and evaluating that. And so these processes, like the public health model, like the strategic prevention framework, these offer us a method in order to develop a strategic plan.
Has your strategic planning experience involved designing statewide plans?
Yes.
And how many statewide plans have you developed? If you can recall.
Several. I can try and name them. There have been 2 statewide plans specifically around mental health and suicide. One was a comprehensive plan on the prevention of mental illness and substance use prevention. In addition to that, a state suicide prevention plan. Also 2 plans around prescription drug use for the state, and probably more.
And when developing these large-scale plans, is it typical that you coordinate with a diverse range of stakeholders?
Yes, it's essential. That it's a quality in terms of putting together a plan that I think is essential to make sure that you have a diverse body of professionals contributing information and also contributing from their own fields about what is best practice. It's also a process of determining priorities often and looking at which interventions are most important, which ones are most cost effective, which ones have been studied or not studied, what sort of resources are available, and that is absolutely a collaborative process.
Have you been published in any peer-reviewed journals?
Yes,
How many times?
twice.
Do you recall, can you describe those peer-reviewed publications if you can recall?
It's been some time, but one was a qualitative description of the process that the state underwent in my agency and in the prevention division to develop what are called regional epidemiological outcome work groups. These are essentially local committees that work at the community level to collect local data on substance use problems. What this allows communities to do is to study the problem of substance use locally, looking at zip code level data, looking at county level data, understanding trends, and that project really was to teach EPI principles to local community leaders so that they could undertake these methods in the future on their own. It was really about building capacity, helping them identify data gaps. Another article was about a project that I did with Mercy Health System here in Oklahoma County. What we did was a physician and healthcare provider survey about their knowledge and confidence in intervening with suicide within a healthcare setting. And from that particular survey, we were able to work together between the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services and Mercy Health System to develop a plan for their system to improve identification of suicide risk factors, intervention methods to improve training within their system to recognize and respond to suicide risk.
So you mentioned about your presenting. What are the topics that you typically present on?
There are a number of topics. I've presented quite a bit in the state on alcohol and underage drinking. I've made presentations and testimony about abuse of over-the-counter products and inhalants. I often present about opioid use and also opioid overdose, mental health. In addition to that, suicide prevention, marijuana use in particular is a subject I've been presenting on frequently. Really a range of topics.
And what are some of the national organizations you've presented at? I think you might have mentioned one or two.
Yes. Just recently, a few. So there's something called the National Council for Behavioral Health, and I recently did a national presentation about our opioid and screening programs here in Oklahoma to a national audience. Also the National Prevention Network Research Conference multiple times. Presenting at meetings of the National Association of State Alcohol and Drug Directors, to name a few.
Do you hold any leadership positions in addition to your role as senior director?
Yes, I'm on the executive management team at the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, also the vice president of the National Prevention Network.
And is that an association of all prevention directors in the country?
It is. It's my colleagues in every state and territory in the country.
So you've worked on preventing substance abuse and misuse throughout your entire career, is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. At what point did prescription opioids become a significant focus of your work?
So in terms of a significant focus, I would say around 2010 is when I would say a significant amount of my job, day to day, week to week, involved addressing the opioid crisis. In 2008, I indicated we applied for that grant for our prevention system, and I recall a milestone, I think, or a turning point in our understanding of the scope of this problem in Oklahoma. When we were conducting that statewide needs assessment, we began a partnership with the Injury Prevention Service at the State Health Department a couple of years prior on suicide prevention, and looking at medical examiner reports and things like that, and violent death. And around that time is when it was predicted that drug overdose death would soon exceed car crash deaths in our state as it had nationally. That came out in a report, I think around 2011. But of course, we had collaborative relationships with the State Health Department, had been monitoring this very closely, and also advising in certain capacities here and there. But after that grant came to the state and we named prescription drug use as a priority issue and began funding projects actively, and also in my role being assigned by Commissioner White to oversee the development of a state plan around prescription drug use, and specifically reducing opioid overdose death in 2012. That is really when my day-to-day life as a professional here in Oklahoma really shifted, and I, since that time, spend a significant amount of my time on addressing the opioid crisis.
Would you say you're working on the opioid crisis daily?
Yes.
Now, you are also involved in work groups addressing the opioid crisis in Oklahoma, is that true?
That's true.
And can you tell the court what some of those work groups are that you're involved in?
Yes, so first there is the state, what we call the RX work group, that actually developed the two state plans and has stayed together to oversee those plans. That's one. In addition to that, we have an opioid overdose committee. I'm also a member of a perinatal committee specifically looking at opioid use and opioid use disorder in pregnant and postpartum women. In addition to that, I have worked on numerous committees around developing pain and opioid guidelines, including in pregnancy. I've also been on a committee in developing a practice dissemination program with the University of Oklahoma for primary care practices in safer and more effective pain treatment in Oklahoma.
So after you had this grant and you said your agency was actively working on this issue by 2009 or after you received this grant, it's my understanding that at some point that role expanded from an agency role as far as dealing with prescription opioids to a statewide initiative. Is that correct?
That's true.
So what occurred, how did it happen that it progressed from an agency role to a statewide initiative?
There was a diverse statewide committee looking at prevention services across the state of Oklahoma, chaired by Commissioner White. And at that time, we had brought forward this grant to that committee to serve in an advisory role for the grant to help us oversee our work at the department on this particular large grant for our prevention system. And within that particular working body looking at prevention services across the state of Oklahoma, it was determined that it was necessary for us as a state to develop a comprehensive plan to reduce opioid overdose in Oklahoma. Commissioner White assigned me, and then I had a colleague at the State Department of Health who was assigned to co-chair the development of a work group, of a team, to come together and put a plan in place and then to oversee that plan. And so in 2012, that group was convened by me and my colleague at the State Health Department. It was a very diverse group, many of whom we were working actively for the first time across disciplines on this particular issue. So that state plan got developed by that committee after several sessions, working sessions, very intense working sessions to develop that plan. And of course, we were under, it was urgent. It was urgent that we get that plan developed as quickly as possible and that we start coordinating services within the state of Oklahoma to the best of our ability. And also identifying funding resources and other methods to start to implement aspects of this plan. And so very early in 2013, that plan was officially published, although we had already really started working on implementing the priorities that were identified.
And what was the goal of the plan?
Well, we discussed as a group what sorts of measures we wanted to have in place and decided that because the matter was so pressing and was impacting Oklahoma so severely at that time, we decided to focus specifically on opioid-involved overdose death. And we identified in that plan that we wanted to reduce that by 15% in the state in 5 years.
And in creating the plan, did you rely on any recommendations, like federal recommendations?
Yes. So the Office of National Drug Control Policy issues a plan, a federal plan each year. In 2011, they had, I'll call a supplement. I don't know if they would call it a supplement, but an additional plan that came out specifically around prescription drug use. That plan really did help guide us as a state. If I recall, at that time, there were a few states that had organized a comprehensive state plan. There were some, and we did consider and look at other states' plans at that time, but that federal plan allowed us to build a framework of the different types of modules we would want to have, the different types of services that would be required, and our working team did use that as sort of a planning framework, yes.
And for purposes of your testimony today, did you create a PowerPoint of sorts that you think will aid in your testimony?
Yes.
And do you think that will be helpful to the court when you testify today?
I do.
Your Honor, I have a PowerPoint that I'd like to hand out and publish.
Mr. Brody?
I'll take a look at it first. If that would be good.
Yep.
So most of this is-
They already have it.
They're gonna blow it up. It's just a timeline of actions the state, things that the state has done, taken from that, that actions taken chart that she produced to you guys.
What's this one? That's fine, you take your time.
I can't read page 2, but I know where it is, so no objection to using
All right, you may publish.
function of my eyes and my.
Thank you, and can I make this a court exhibit?
Yes.
95, I think? Maybe?
We have more than that. We'll give it a number later.
Okay, sounds good.
I think it's 97, Your Honor.
This shall be Court Exhibit 97.
So we were talking about the state plan that you co-chaired. That came out in 2013, correct?
Yes.
And was there a follow-up plan that occurred?
Yes, in 2016, there was a review and new plan issued.
And how, so can you kind of describe the process and why there was a new plan issued?
Sure. So after the plan came out in 2013, as I had mentioned, there was quite a bit of activity and progress towards meeting the goals within the 2013 plan. Probably more than we had anticipated in terms of what we were able to accomplish in that amount of time. In fact, we were able to meet our goal around reducing opioid-involved overdose deaths in a shorter period of time than we had thought. At that time, we also had seen several things happen nationally with regard to additional state plans coming out from other states, federal guidelines being released, best practice documents were beginning to really come out. It was important that we reconvene specifically to look at our plan and to update it, to make sure we could move off of some of the things that we had accomplished and add in new items, and also shifting focus in some ways to other aspects of the plan. Here on the screen is a listing of many of the accomplishments that came out of these two plans. The first being opioid guidelines. In our state, we developed two sets of guidelines, one for primary care and office-based settings, one for urgent care and emergency department settings. We also launched very shortly after the 2013 plan a naloxone program for opioid overdose reversal, first starting in the state with a first responder program providing naloxone medication to law enforcement agencies. We started first in Tulsa County and probably underestimated how quickly we would gain traction and support and have success with that particular program. We were able to recruit nearly every law enforcement agency in Tulsa County, including the city police, sheriff, state, and even some tribal, to come together very early on to learn about law enforcement deployment of naloxone, to be educated in opioid overdose emergency signs, and also put some policies and procedures in place within those agencies to be able to administer naloxone in the course of their regular duty. In addition to that, in these two plans, we elevated and provided research and support and informational material to legislators and other groups about certain policies that we thought would make a significant impact. One of those was requiring the use of the prescription monitoring program in Oklahoma, and that was accomplished. In addition to that, we launched as a state a public education campaign where it was multifaceted. We used web, social media, and also community-based grassroots approaches to really door knock and talk to people, get out in communities and schools, and teach them new skills. Not only provide new information, but give them real actionable things that they could do to participate in addressing the opioid crisis. That public education campaign developed quite a bit of recognition and support. We were asked, in fact, to speak about that effort nationally for states elsewhere that were looking to do the same. In addition to that, we had a significant increase in the number of waivered physicians in the state of Oklahoma through multiple agency and organizations' efforts to increase medication-assisted treatment in the state. Also, within these two state plans was an effort to fund a network of community coalitions working on safer storage and also disposal within the state of Oklahoma for opioid products, to make sure that they could not be used, or that children would not be exposed to them, or that they would circulate in the community in a way that could create an additional public health harm. Also, the Bureau of Narcotics had developed a robust disposal system, really, in the state of Oklahoma, providing public disposal boxes throughout the state in order for community residents to use. In addition to that, out of these state plans came legislation around hydrocodone refills. So prior to the DEA rescheduling hydrocodone, Oklahoma took action around not allowing refills of hydrocodone in our state. And in addition to that, there was also legislation on mandating electronic prescribing in our state, and that has had a delayed implementation and will go into effect very early in 2020. So much like the state of New York, and Oklahoma was one of the first states to pursue this, we were able to help educate and provide information to legislators about the value of this, and work with different groups to support and understand the need for electronic prescribing in our state. There was also a policy around allowing the State Department of Health and the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services to have access to prescription monitoring data. The purpose of this was to meet some of the recommendation of the National Center for Excellence for PDMPs, which at that time had provided some consultation to the state of Oklahoma about using our PMP data for public health purposes, really to expand and enhance the PMP and our ability to utilize that data to understand certain things that were happening in our state, why they were happening, and to design interventions. So not only was that a law, but that was around the time, and I didn't mention this earlier, that We developed an Oklahoma PNP Advisory Committee, which still exists, and that is comprised of our agency, the State Health Department, and the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, where we coordinate on PNP data sharing. We look and discuss research and studies that can be done. We advise on certain enhancements and things within the system to make it more user-friendly for not only the provider, but also to give the most important critical information as quickly as possible to the provider to make good clinical decisions. Also from these plans came a significant amount of provider education. 3 agencies, as a result of these plans, have developed what are called practice dissemination programs, where primary care offices and in some cases perhaps other specialty offices are enrolled in long-term educational programs where they are given continuing medical education, but they are also assigned a practice facilitator, goes into their practice and spends time with them. Depending on which program it is, it could be up to a year, maybe 2 years in some cases, teaching them the CDC guidelines, the Oklahoma guidelines, also Oklahoma law with regard to controlled substances and opioids, and helping them adapt their workflows to improve prescribing. So that is just actually a small sample of some of the recommendations that are represented within these plans and that have been accomplished. Each one of these really could have a slide deck this thick on the amount of effort, time, and strategic planning and resource development that it has taken to really mobilize each one of these initiatives.
And are these the only actions the state has taken to address the opioid crisis in the
No.
state? So can you discuss some of the other actions that the state has taken outside of the 2 state plans that you testified about today?
Yes. So in preparation for one of my depositions, in fact, I created a chart, I think it was 16 pages long, of state actions related to addressing the opioid crisis in Oklahoma. And even that process was very difficult to capture from each agency and entity, all the different activity and actions that have been taken. This is hopefully an improved effort to consolidate that 16 pages and then some into a timeline to mark some of the key milestones, I would say, around some of the state's actions. So just go through this. In 1990 is when Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics implemented the first PNP system. At that time was called the OSTAR, to track Schedule II prescriptions. In 2002, the Healthcare Authority first implemented their lock-in program, where they had select Sooner Care members who were locked into a pharmacy and a provider. And these are typically riskier patients or who have complicated pharmacotherapy, which would benefit from a program such as this. In 2004, the Healthcare Authority also instituted quantity limits for select opioid medications. In 2006, the Bureau of Narcotics expanded the PNP to track additional schedules 3 through 4. In 2007, the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services formalized a partnership with the opioid treatment providers in the state in order to work with them in partnership on quality improvement measures and best practices. The Healthcare Authority also during that year instituted quantity limits for opioid combination products. And in addition, the State Health Department launched the unintentional poisoning surveillance system that I think you've heard testimony to continue Dr. Piercefield's work around collecting opioid-involved overdose death, unintentional. In 2008, the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority established opioid analgesic class, and they implemented a 3-tier step therapy process for opioid medications. And in 2010, the Healthcare Authority implemented a 12-script per year limit on hydrocodone. And the PNP law required pharmacies to start reporting Schedules 2 through 5, dispensing within 24 hours. That one in particular has been noted nationally and has made Oklahoma a leader in this area in terms of having the only real-time PNP system in the country. In 2011, the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services developed what are known as CCARCs, or Comprehensive Community Addiction Resource Centers, and that greatly increased the array of treatment services that were available within the system of care in the local level. So these CCARCs were able to provide the full range of addiction treatment services. The Bureau of Narcotics launched the program I referenced earlier, the Safe Trips for Scripts program, which also has been a national model for other states, particularly in terms of their partnerships with Covanta Energy to destroy those products for our state, which has really allowed us to expand that program and have at least one box in every county. In 2012 was when I mentioned the Oklahoma Prescription Work Group was formed and started developing that first opioid crisis plan. The PNP law also started to require real-time reporting, I had referenced that last one incorrectly. Within 5 minutes of dispensing, that made the real-time system. In 2013, Oklahoma issued their first 2 sets of opioid prescribing guidelines. That was led by the state health department in partnership with the medical associations and the medical licensure boards and the Department of Mental Health and many other partners. Oklahoma State University began to offer in 2013 one of the first and only addiction medicine courses in the nation for medical students. That same year, the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services launched the law enforcement naloxone program that I've told you about, starting in Tulsa County and rapidly increasing to about 275 law enforcement agencies in the state. That year also was when we released, officially published the state plan to reduce prescription drug abuse in Oklahoma. In 2014, the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services launched a pharmacy naloxone program. What that was to increase the use of standing orders or protocols that were signed between a physician and a licensed pharmacist in order to dispense naloxone under a standing order. This greatly and rapidly increased public access to naloxone. In other words, this is the same process that's used for adult immunization. So when you walk into a Walgreens and you get a flu shot from your pharmacist, you did not have to take in a prescription, right, from your doctor. This is the same process that we identified as a way to legally but swiftly get more naloxone into the community. Many states were still struggling at this time with how to make that as available. The Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services in 2014 also acquired those CCARCs to start providing long-term medication-assisted treatment. So at that time, they had on staff waivered physicians or in partnership on contract to provide those services in those community locations. The Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services also started requiring all community mental health centers to offer medication-assisted treatment and an array of services that they already provided. And also that same year, the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services launched the public education campaign that I referenced earlier. In 2015, the PNP law started requiring prescribers to check the PNP during a patient's initial visit and every 180 days thereafter. And prior to prescribing opioids, benzos, and I always get this wrong, but I'll call it Soma for now. In 2015, the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services and the Healthcare Authority also started a partnership to implement naloxone for young adults. So this was under a federal program called CHIP, where we were now allowed to offer naloxone to young people aged 19 and younger in the state of Oklahoma.
So let me stop you right there. So in your opinion, the state has done, and this is just part of the things that the state has done to address the crisis in Oklahoma.
Yes.
Okay, so even with everything on this timeline, this doesn't capture it. Is that fair to say? Has the state's actions to address the opioid crisis, you said that the goal of the prescription state plan, the first one was to reduce opioid overdose by 15%.
Yes.
And were those efforts successful?
Yes, they were very successful. And in fact, since that first state plan came out in 2013, opioid-involved overdose death has gone down 43%.
Now, are those statistics still high?
Yes, absolutely.
Is Oklahoma still in an opioid crisis?
There's no doubt. We've seen an increase, in fact, in other opioid overdose deaths, and we are absolutely still too high.
Do you think the state has done the best that it can with the resources it has to address this crisis?
Yes, I do.
Did the state ask you to create an abatement plan?
Yes.
And did you develop that abatement plan?
Yes, I was responsible for developing the framework for that plan, elevating the key recommendations, and together working with Commissioner White and other professionals and other agencies, prioritizing those and finalizing that plan.
And what processes, you talked some about the public health model. Is that a model that you use to develop the abatement plan?
Yes, in some ways, yes. We went through a process of looking at data in key areas that Oklahoma had significant need. Of course, opioid overdose death and hospitalizations were there. But in addition to that, we looked at opioid use disorder, likely opioid use disorder. We looked at issues of child removal within the child welfare system related to opioids. We looked at a host of indicators to understand where we were as a state, to really identify the areas that needed to be part of the abatement plan.
Okay, and looking at this timeline, can you just go over, we stopped at 2015. Can you just go over a few of the actions the state has taken from 2015 on? You don't have to go through all of them. There's a lot. You can see that from this graph, the actions are increasing over time, but just highlight some of the actions the state has taken during that time period.
Okay, so I would say I would highlight, first of all, in 2016, the expansion of the overdose education naloxone distribution program to a take-home naloxone program, which we now have about 76 community hubs throughout the state providing naloxone to those who are likely to witness overdose and also those who are using opioids. That has been a significant expansion of our work in overdose prevention. I would also highlight the launch of Project ECHO, which I know you've had testimony about, so I won't describe that in further detail, but has really been an invaluable resource to the state to assist physicians in implementing best practice guidelines and to allow them to develop an expertise in addiction medicine so that they can work with these complex conditions and chronic conditions that they're now seeing every day in their practices. In addition to that, I would also highlight the fact that we have undertaken an effort to bring in non-opioid pain therapies into the state. Specifically, our agency has hosted and is continuing to plan to train additional clinicians in cognitive behavioral therapy for pain, and have now increased the number of clinicians in the state to about 75 that can provide that service. I would highlight the Attorney General's Oklahoma's Commission on Opioid Abuse. This has really been a significant lift in terms of elevating either items within these plans that were systematic in nature, were complex, required a lot of resources, or they required policy change that had not been accomplished, and also bringing forward new ideas in 2017 that may or may not have been articulated in the prior plans.
And were you asked to present, or did you present at the Oklahoma Opioid Commission?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, at this time, based on Ms. Hawkins' education, skills, and training, I'd like to offer, or the state would like to offer Ms. Hawkins as an expert on the scope of the Oklahoma opioid crisis and its impact on the health and safety of Oklahoma citizens, the abatement plan, the length of time for which the services and programs in the abatement plan need to be in effect to abate the Oklahoma opioid crisis, past actions the state has taken to abate the crisis, the cost of the services in the abatement plan, and the programs and services of the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services that are provided to Oklahoma citizens.
And Your Honor, we would object on all the grounds previously stated in the Dow motion that we filed good trial to reassert all of those grounds that are in the written motion.
I will overrule the defendant's objections as has been previously decided by the motions in limine, but renewed again this afternoon. And I find that Ms. Hawkins is qualified to render expert opinion in those areas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So when you were talking about the public health model, you mentioned that you first assessed the problem, and that when it comes to the opioid crisis in Oklahoma, you did that as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
And can you talk about what is the scope of the Oklahoma opioid crisis?
I know there's been significant testimony so far regarding opioid overdose death. I think that is a metric that really has stood out to all of us, obviously, is the ultimate harm that has been created by this opioid crisis. But I wanted to show this to also highlight other consequences that have come not only to our state, but to others from this particular crisis in addition to death. So this really just illustrates the scope and the impact of this problem on people in our state. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention developed this, and it shows that for every one prescription or illicit opioid overdose death in 2015, there were 18 people who had a substance use disorder involving heroin. There were 62 people who had a substance use disorder involving prescription opioids. For every one death, there were 377 people who misused prescription opioids in the past year. And for every one death, there were 2,946 people who used prescription opioids in the past year. I think it's important, obviously, that we focus effort, time, and attention, and that a measure of the abatement plan in particular be around opioid overdose death. It's vitally important. But there are many more consequences to our state and adverse harms that have occurred because of this crisis. These included, I'll mention, because I don't know that I've heard anyone else yet mention that in just a short number of years, I think it's been 5 years, we've had more than 4,000 hospitalizations due to opioid-involved overdose. These are people who had non-fatal encounters with opioids, but whose injuries were so severe that it required them to be admitted to a hospital. And we have that from our Oklahoma discharge database, and that just accounts for people who went on to go into a hospital room, and not those who went into an emergency department, for example, and may have been discharged directly home. In addition to that, I would note the number of neonatal abstinence syndrome births in our state. The last year for which we have data, there are approximately 500 Sooner Care members who have had an NAS birth in our state, which represents a sharp increase in Oklahoma in this. And of course, a significant number of those are suffering from neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome, which I know you've had some testimony about. In addition to that, as a preventionist, I really want to highlight the impact on young people in our state. NAS is obviously one of those consequences, but when we look at survey data, for example, that the state health department collects and that we collect among high school students in Oklahoma, we have about 16% of our Oklahoma high school students who report misusing prescription opioids in our state. outside of alcohol and marijuana, as compared to other drugs, that is one of the most prevalent drugs being used by high school students. And there's some research that indicates that about half of those kids who initiate in high school will go on and continue to use opioids after or into their young adulthood. So I just name those and show this visual in order to really help us all understand the depth of harm of this opioid crisis in Oklahoma.
And is there a difference between the scope of the crisis and the nature of the crisis?
Yes. So we've talked about this, I think, before in prevention and in public health. When we talk about scope, we're talking about looking at what's happening. We can use descriptive statistics like this to be able to help us document and demonstrate the number of people who are impacted and what sort of things are happening to people, families, communities. But the nature of the problem is slightly different. What that really looks at is why. It helps us understand in prevention science and in behavioral health what's driving the problem. And we also, from time to time, and in many cases, collect data around risk factors for the development of substance use problems and other problem behaviors. For example, we collect data among 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in Oklahoma that not only ask them questions like this about what they're consuming and what's happening to them, but we also ask them questions about certain risk in their life that will predict future problems. And some of the things that we know from the research in terms of risk for developing opioid use disorder and for having problems with substance use are things like availability and ease of access. This is true for tobacco, for alcohol, for opioids. The reason why these are our most prevalently used drugs, particularly among young people, is because they're widely available. So access, ease of access and availability is a risk factor that's been demonstrated in the research as being part of the nature of the problem. And so when we're looking at a plan, for example, we have to have in this plan a way to address those risk factors. Another risk factor that's been demonstrated is perception of harm. When young people in particular do not perceive something as harmful, use goes up. In fact, this has been demonstrated over and over again. It's a complete inverse relationship. So when we measure and ask young people, for example, do you think these things are harmful? Do you think that you'll get in trouble? Do you think there'll be consequences? There's a whole set of things that you can ask young people about their perception of harm. When they report, no, we don't think it's very harmful, the use that they report to us is absolutely inverted, so use goes up. In fact, in prevention, we at times are able to predict a future trend of use when we start to see perception of harm change. And we've seen that happen in this opioid crisis, that young people do not necessarily perceive that opioids are harmful. That is part of the nature of the problem, and so we have to address that. In addition to that, I would just note community norms is another well-established risk factor for the development of substance use disorder. And there are many others, but we have 40 years of research in prevention science that tells us a very clear set of factors that drive problems, which gives us the opportunity to prevent those problems, which is great, and we can design programs and interventions around them. And so I think that's what you're asking about. The nature of the problem is sort of why these things are happening.
And is the abatement plan that you and Commissioner White developed addressing both the scope and nature of the Oklahoma opioid crisis?
Yes.
So let's talk about the abatement plan. Would it be helpful to look at a slide summarizing the abatement plan?
Yes.
Does this slide contain an accurate summary of the state's abatement plan?
Yes, for the first year cost.
And can you just describe one by one the different categories of the abatement plan?
Yes, thank you. So I would say that there are really 3 pillars of this plan, and these categories really do describe them here. One is prevention, which is combined here with treatment. So prevention is essential, and it's here located in this first section. The second is treatment and recovery services, and perhaps the most critical pressing need we have in this abatement plan is our treatment services. In addition to that, another pillar is overdose prevention and response. Those three things together have been identified by the Health and Human Services Agency as the essential, three things you must have in order to address this public health crisis. In addition to that, we know, and it has been testified already, that medical education is I'll call it a component of prevention and treatment. Some of the things that have been described by Dr. Croft are both preventive in nature by improving pain care, using safer, more effective pain care, and reducing unnecessary exposures of pain patients to opioids. And they're both treatment in nature, because she also described to you the ways in which we can improve our healthcare system in treating opioid use disorder right in the primary care office and vastly increasing the treatment access in our state. Also contained within this plan is components around neonatal abstinence syndrome, detecting it, documenting it, and providing services to infants and their families. And then finally, there are two categories, one around data collection, reporting, and conducting research. It's a smaller piece of the plan in total, but incredibly important. And every federal plan I've seen and recommendation around best practices in abating this crisis includes a recommendation around improving state surveillance systems, data collection, and reporting. And then finally, enforcement and regulatory. When I think about this problem and I think about the role that opioids play, I very keenly understand them to be a Schedule II narcotic drug. This is not an ordinary commodity. These products have to be regulated. States have to have the resources in place in order to enforce laws that we're able to put forward to the legislature. It doesn't do us any good to have laws in place that can't be enforced, and also to regulate these products with really the rigor that they require.
Now, you know that Dr. Croft testified today on certain aspects of the abatement plan, and she testified that those portions were necessary, in her opinion, to abate the opioid crisis, and that the costs embedded in those plans were reasonable and necessary. Do you agree with Dr. Croft?
Yes.
And we've heard testimony from Dr. Andrew Kolodny and Dr. Jason Beeman that treatment services in the plan are not only medically necessary to abate the opioid crisis, but essential to abating this crisis. And do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
So can you just describe for the court the slide that you put together and what it shows?
Okay. So I did this pie chart because I suppose as a somebody who creates budgets and plans, I was interested to see the array of services that were involved in this abatement plan, more than what we were seeing in the table, which was difficult to interpret just like that. So this just offers a look at the first year costs that are put forward in the abatement plan and puts them into these categories so you can see at a glance how the costs are distributed. I think it's a very appropriate representation, and I was pleased to see how this came out. We've talked, and we just talked about the importance of treatment and recovery services and the investments that need to happen in order to urgently meet the needs of all of the people in Oklahoma who have opioid use disorder and developing opioid use disorder and who are recovering from opioid use disorder. In addition to that, treatment is critical. Naloxone and overdose prevention is urgently needed. We have to continue on the path that we have started around overdose prevention. But in order to truly abate the crisis and end the crisis in the state of Oklahoma, we have to have a significant investment in prevention, really move upstream as much as possible to prevent new cases of addiction. And one of the ways that we do that in the most essential way, in a pressing way, is through medical education that's been testified to. And of course, you see in the smallest allocation here is enforcement and data collection and administration to oversee and monitor the plan.
So let's move on and talk about addiction treatment services. Is this part of the abatement plan that you developed?
Yes.
And can you explain to the court what treatment services are in the plan?
Yes, so within the abatement plan, this component really is to create what I'll call an opioid use disorder program, treatment program, which would serve all Oklahoma residents who have opioid use disorder. They would be eligible to receive as biopsychosocial assessment based on the American Society of Addiction Medicine level of care placement criteria, and included in this treatment component are different types of services, including early intervention, outpatient services, ambulatory detoxification, intensive outpatient, partial hospitalization, residential, medically managed detoxification, and medication.
And so can you walk the court through what each of these services are and why they're in the plan, and how the costs were developed for this portion of the abatement plan? And if it helps, we have a chart.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So first I'll just say, in case you're not familiar with the ASAM placement criteria, this is a clinical protocol best practice that once somebody is assessed for opioid use disorder based on the severity of their symptoms and other factors like social conditions like housing and things like that, people are then placed into a certain level of care that's appropriate for where they are in their opioid use disorder. And so what you see here in this list are the ASAM levels of care, which we would have to have within the state of Oklahoma. These costs are based on an estimate provided by the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services of Oklahomans who have opioid use disorder. I'll just remind that opioid use disorder is on a continuum of mild, moderate, and severe. And so utilizing an estimate of 35,000 Oklahomans who would benefit and require opioid use disorder treatment services that fall into these categories, multiplied by the established rates for these services that the state of Oklahoma pays for these interventions, is how the costs were tabulated. Each of these services, if you don't mind going back to the other, thank you. Each of these services increase in intensity as you go down the chart. Early intervention, for example, being more of an educational or group setting type service. Outpatient services being what you might think of as talk therapy or counseling. Ambulatory detox would be outpatient withdrawal management programs, and then moving on up to intensive outpatients, partial hospitalization and residential care, and also medically managed detox, which include different levels of supervision by medical providers and medication. So would you like me to go through the costs?
Sure.
Okay.
Do you need the next chart?
Yes, that would be great, thank you. So you can see here, and actually this chart serves as a resource for this first treatment services and also for the next one that we'll go over. But you can see the number of slots that are required In each of these different levels of care, on any given day in Oklahoma, we will require 5,000 early intervention service spots, 15,000 outpatient service spots, also 5,000 ambulatory detox slots, intensive outpatient 5,000 slots, partial hospitalization 5,000, residential levels of care, moderate, high, and then also services for women with children. And you'll see the calculations there. Medically managed detoxification, 250 slots, and medication for 7,500. Also on the right-hand side are each of the rates that are paid for these services in the state of Oklahoma. So for early intervention in this component, the cost would be $5 million. For outpatient services, the cost $37.5 million. Ambulatory detoxification services, $24 million. Intensive outpatient services, $40.5 million. Partial hospitalization services, $51 million. Residential care, $41,625,000. Medically managed detoxification, residential, $13,687,500, and medication at a cost of $9 million.
And so can you explain what's the medication portion of the treatment costs and services?
So that would cover the medications that we've heard already discussed for buprenorphine and other medications that are used in medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder.
And do you believe that the treatment services, both the services and the costs are a conservative estimate of the need to treat Oklahomans with OUD?
Yes, I do. In terms of the needs that exist in Oklahoma today and also into the future, I believe that these estimates are conservative. They're likely low in terms of what we've seen confirming the recommendation around the number of people who will require these services. We've been able to also take into consideration data about the number of people who have diagnoses already for opioid use disorder in the state of Oklahoma. And in addition to that, we know that we have growing needs around opioid use disorder in certain communities in our state, and also with potential growth in heroin and other opioid use disorder. I think that they are conservative.
And the calculations, the net present value calculation for 2019, who did that calculation?
Dr. Room.
And based on your qualifications, your education, your training, your skill and experience, do you believe that the costs for addiction treatment services that you just discussed here are reasonable and necessary to implement this part of the abatement plan?
Yes.
And what's your opinion on that?
That they are reasonable and necessary.
Ms. Baldwin, before you get to supplementary services, I think I'm going to cut you off.
That's fair.
All right.
Okay.
Was that going to be your next question?
Well, hang on. What is the total 1-year cost?
Oh, sorry. $232,947,071.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Let's go ahead and stop there because we've got some other matters and then we will need to quit. So we'll excuse the witness for the remainder of the day. Here's what I want to do. We're going to come back tomorrow morning at 8:30. That gets people excited because we do have a shorter time frame tomorrow. I'm told by Jamie that there's a tentative 1:30 status conference on the Teva settlement. And then I need to know from Johnson & Johnson about the motion to quash. Have we got any announcements on that?
I spoke with the counsel for Dr. Halford briefly today. He was pushing to have it heard by tomorrow because the subpoena had a Monday date in it. I explained to him that it had a Monday date because that was the anticipated date by which we thought our case would start. So we didn't actually need him here by Monday. I don't know if we have any way to further discuss this with counsel, whether we need to have it heard tomorrow or not. We spoke briefly with Reggie about it. I don't know if you've had a chance to talk or not.
Is the issue simply when? Because y'all subpoenaed him, we don't care when.
Right, we subpoenaed him because you all wouldn't agree to let us use the depositions.
Yeah, we're not going to agree to that.
Okay.
But if it's just an issue of date,
No, it's not. They both the motions, I've skimmed the motions. Both the doctors, I understand it, want the motions quashed. They want us to use the depositions.
yes, we would not agree to that. 'Cause
That's my understanding as well. So what I propose is that after Ms. Hawkins's testimony is completed tomorrow, we can reserve some time for the motions to quash, assuming we get done before 4 o'clock.
See,
I mean, if,
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
Okay.
if
Yeah.
they've requested a hearing, and if the matter's not resolved, then we can ask counsel for the doctors to be here and be prepared to argue the motion when we're done with Ms. Hawkins.
fine.
What time do I tell
I tell them sometime in the afternoon. They can probably be here as early as 2 o'clock, and they can wait until we're done.
Thank you.
All right.
I think the text of the hearing is tentative, it doesn't have confirmation. So he said as soon as he got that confirmation, he was sent back on the email for he had to go and see that's not.
Right, so we have a tentative 1:30. If it doesn't happen, then we just keep going.
we'll let you know in the morning. There's a different clock we've had to deal with a lot.
Sure.
That's it.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a
Appreciate
good
that.
evening.